This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Have you been feeling a bit more sleepy lately? Maybe you're reaching for that second or third cup of coffee like I might be doing right now? Well, it could be because of daylight saving time. Turns out the effects of springing forward could take anywhere from a few days to a few weeks to actually wear off. That's according to the Sleep Foundation. So the big question is, why do we even have daylight saving time? Is getting a little extra daylight worth the disruption? Today, we unpack the history behind daylight saving time and hear about efforts to change it. Joining us today is Brianna Garrison, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Social Work with the Southern Connecticut State University. Brianna, thanks for joining on Where We Live.
Thanks for having me.
And also with us from New Hampshire is Carol Connor. She's the editor of the Old Farmer's Almanac. Thanks so much, Carol, for joining us this morning.
Glad to be here.
And listeners, I know you have questions just like I do. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Carol, I want to start with you here before we get into the impacts. I want to kind of remind everyone, what exactly is daylight saving time in basic terms?
Daylight savings time is just a time, just like you said, changing the clocks to gain daylight ostensibly. So it started, Benjamin Franklin was really the first in our country. He wrote an economical project in 1784 saying, like, people should get up at the crack of dawn, kind of a call to arms. And then in 1907, William Willett, he's an Englishman, he takes it up. He was riding on his horse and sees daylight being wasted. Oh, goodness gracious, But these ideas were not, they didn't take hold. But it was World War I. Germany, I think, started it, and then the British. And it was really to conserve coal and energy. And so it held on for a short time. And then in World War II, we revisited daylight savings time again. And again, that was an energy conserving measure. And it lasted not long. I don't even think it lasted a year. But then various moves along the way, though I would say from the farmer's perspective, they were always fighting it. By 1966, we institute it. And then in 2005, I think many of us remember, we changed the dates. Yet I think it's in 66, Arizona and Hawaii, abstainers and also territories. So, several parts of our states do not observe daylight savings. They have been on standard time for quite some time.
And so just really quickly here, because we're going to be throwing out these phrases throughout the conversation, what is the difference between daylight saving time and standard time?
It's an hour difference. Like we said, in March, we set those clocks forward. We spring forward an hour, and that's to ostensibly catch more of that daylight at the end of the day for those of us who live. And of course, this is less relative for people that live further south than us. In Kentucky, they have light till 6:30 sometimes in the winter. It's amazing. But then, in the fall, we are falling back. And again, that's bringing the clock backwards to catch as much of the daylight as we can actually in the morning. So that's the idea.
Well, and so, Brianna, it's really interesting that we change the clock twice a year, and it doesn't seem like that's a lot of change, but it can be disruptive to our sleep and sort of figuring out how to change all the clocks as well. How disruptive can it really be?
Yeah. So a lot of the current research shows that particularly after these changes, there are more hospital visits for heart attacks and strokes. Strokes are actually up 8% following both of the time changes. Car crashes are up 6% following time changes. And then you see a lot of mental health changes too. Those that are, we already have high levels of anxiety, depression, and sleep disturbances, especially in the last 5 years. Those have all increased.
Mm.
But daylight savings seems to have a really big impact on those mental health disorders as well, with more crises happening after the time change. And sleep affects so much, and really puts strain on the body in ways that I think we minimize too much.
Well, can you talk about sort of the long-term side effects? I think you mentioned some that may happen immediately, say, unfortunately, car accidents. Um, you mentioned mental health and also physical health. So what are some of the long-term side effects to daylight saving that we might see by losing sleep or having disruption to that sleep?
Yeah, so, the thing that I try to tell people all the time is brain health is holistic health, and sleep affects our whole system. So, if we are not getting enough sleep, what we typically see, and because our bodies are dependent on the world around us, our environment, for those neuroreceptors like serotonin and melatonin. Um, that affects everything. We see long-term impacts, particularly on the cardiovascular system. So really our bodies feeling the impact of getting less sleep, of having more, anxiousness. Sometimes the anxiousness is about sleep itself. I can't go to sleep. You're laying there kind of restless and wondering why it's so hard to fall asleep. Functioning throughout the day with the extra pressure and stress on our bodies of not getting enough sleep. Um, and that has a long-term impact. Cardiovascular symptoms, if they're not addressed, impact our cognition, impact our long-term longevity, our mortality. Um, and we're seeing this increase year after year. And part of that is we're already struggling so much with sleep disorders and disruption in sleep patterns from COVID-19, from our increase in technology. But daylight savings really seems to put an additional strain on those things, particularly if we're not engaging in intentional behaviors to reduce those impacts.
Well, and with that sort of idea of long-term side effects to this disruption, I'm also curious to hear about. I know you mentioned disruption of sleep specifically because we also assume it's just 1 hour for one night or one day, but it's actually more than that, right? And then I'm sure it depends on the person, but it seems like a case by case basis in terms of how long it can impact us, right?
Yeah, so I think the misnomer is, well, we'll be tired for a couple days and then we'll be fine. But really, unless you intentionally reset and work on establishing those circadian rhythms, this can be a long, ongoing impact. We're 10 days or so out now, and there are
Hmm.
still almost everybody that I encounter is still talking about how tired they are, um, and how much they're struggling with the change. And part of that is when there's more sunlight that um, tells our brains, delay the melatonin production.
Mm.
So if we're out at night. Maybe we're enjoying, yesterday was a beautiful day here in Connecticut. We're going to go outside and enjoy the sunshine and play till 7 instead of 6 and have dinner later. All of those things impact your body's ability to start shutting itself down and getting ready for sleep. And so if we're not intentionally, blocking out sunlight and cueing our brain, then our brain is saying, well, we've got sunlight, so we're good to go. And so you're losing more than just an hour of sleep. The average number of hours of sleep after daylight savings decreases to about 6 hours. And we need anywhere between 8 and 10 hours, depending on who you are. Kids especially need 10 hours. And with, people see more daylight and it's more sports and
Hmm.
more activities. And that really has a harder impact of making it a long-term change rather than just a short blip in the sleep pattern.
Well, and Carol, you mentioned earlier some context of the history of daylight saving and why we do practice it. Can you expand more about from the farmer's perspective, especially that's a completely different world, I think, in terms of what they see and experience versus what we do?
Right. Well, of course, cows expect to be milked at 5 a.m. and 5 p.m. by a certain clock. And so when we change that, the animals don't change. I think the simplest way to see it is I have a dog, and when the time change happens, the dog is still hungry. My dog Jack is still hungry at the same time he was yesterday. And I'm saying, buddy, no, you got to wait. But of course, we don't typically do that. People who are dealing with the time change. As Brianna said, if you can make intentional changes that are more like what we do, which would be a few more minutes of sunlight a day or daylight a day, that's going to be better. And so I think we do that with our animals, and maybe we don't always do that with ourselves to understand that it does need to be gradual because, Jack is like, there's no reason for me to make him adhere to a clock or a chicken or a cow. But yet the clock does affect those things. If a farmer is, a milk truck is coming to pick up all of the milk at a certain time and that changes, they have to now do another hour earlier. So it doesn't really work that way for animals. They can't adjust that quickly, or they suffer the same consequences that we do. As Brianna outlined, it's a lot to affect circadian rhythm, and animals depend on sleep as well, just like we do.
Well, it is amazing to see that connection, and I don't know if that's something that's really obvious to many in terms of it impacts not just humans but animals as well that do provide those services in different ways. And Brianna, just kind of a follow up here, especially with what Carol just shared. Do you know or have an answer to who this impacts the most? Are we talking like men, women, elderly, those who have to get up early, those who get up later? What is that like?
Yeah, so we see it in kind of three categories. So this definitely affects older adults, especially if there's any kind of cognitive decline. So, one of my areas of specialty is older adults with dementia, and routine and cognitive load is such a big deal. And really making sure that you have some kind of routine. And anytime there's disruptions in those things, it can have a really big impact on symptoms, behavioral symptoms, memory. We also see this with teens. The teens really need a lot more sleep than we're getting. And the research shows year after year, our teens are getting less and less sleep. They go to school earlier than their bodies really are required for them to wake up, and they go to bed much later because they're in activities after school, and then they have homework, and so those are two ends of the spectrum, but we really see them impacted. And then when it comes to, if we're looking at gender differences, we typically see females have a higher impact from the loss of sleep than males. That might be because of traditional expectations when it comes to caregiving and getting sleep. It also is, in general, we see women have higher instances of sleep disorders, anxiety, and so those things could be exacerbated by the time change as well.
So we're going to go back in time for a quick moment here. In the 1970s, the United States tried to make daylight saving time permanent, and it wasn't that popular. We spoke with Dr. David Prairie. He's the author of Seize the Daylight, the curious and contentious story of daylight saving time. And here's what he shared with us.
As I said, the Congress put in this temporary 2 years, and it was so unpopular that they didn't even let it go for the second year. So we have tried year-round daylight saving time. Now, year-round standard time, the negative of that is that you would have daylight at 4 a.m. in the morning when almost everybody is sleeping, and you wouldn't have daylight at 7 or 8 in the evening when everybody's up and can make much better use of that. So you're throwing away over 240 hours of daylight in the evening. And that extra daylight has people outdoors rather than indoors watching the TV. They're outdoors, maybe taking a walk, maybe doing a sport, maybe gardening, whatever they're doing, they're active. And so you get 240 days of active, which is activity, which is good for public health. And also people like it. They don't gain anything by having a daylight between 4 a.m. and 5 a.m.
So, Carol, you mentioned earlier historically that the U.S. tried to do this and did not even go for a second year. Can you talk about the pushback against daylight saving? What are your thoughts?
I think that, yeah, you've seen it all along, and that's why we have the holdout states. And, in Canada, it's the same deal. It's like there's just places that choose not to. And actually, in 18 states right now, there's legislation. So, and I think there's something about, if Congress doesn't pass it, which in 2023 they didn't, I think it passed the Senate, but not the House. And so I think that was to move to daylight savings time permanently. So maybe states are going to do it on their own and where it makes more sense. I think if we had a perfect world, we could do it gradually, but to govern, let's all move our clocks back 5 minutes a day doesn't really feel like that's going to happen very well. But I also feel like we live in a 24-hour world. 99% of us are where there is sky glow. That's disruptive to our sleep, no matter what time the clock says. So I think this idea of fixing the clock is sort of secondary to some of these other issues. I'd also say that we learned about flexibility in the workplace during the pandemic. We could just standardize the time, and then people could make those adjustments in their lives, in their workplaces, and other schedules as well.
And Brianna, do you have any thoughts on the pushback against daylight saving?
Yeah, I mean, I think change is hard. We see that, and I think that's the biggest thing. This is a routine and a known thing for a lot of people. But honestly, I think the reasoning for it, when we dig into the research around it, when we dig into the reasons why it was started and who it's working for, are really all myths, right? And we heard from Carol, the farmers don't like it either. And that's usually the evidence that people use. Well, it's good for the farmers. We need more sunlight. We have so much technology now that there really isn't a reason for us to chase the daylight, and the benefits aren't outweighing the costs. And with all the technology that we have, I think we have to think about the world that we live in. And the reality is some people don't have the flexibility to adjust their schedule. Hospitals have shifts. And there are people that have to be at work by 7 a.m., have to be at work by 8 a.m., and they're going to go in tired. That's just, what we're dealing with this system that we've decided we're all going to agree on.
Right. And when first day of spring today and coming out of winter, of course, and so many people, especially around me, who are craving the sunlight, being outside. We've all been cooped up for a couple of months. So I totally understand that desire of wanting more sunlight. But does having extra sunlight balance out the negative effects for daylight saving? I know you kind of just touched on that a little bit, but maybe expand a little bit more. Does it actually balance things out or no?
No. And that's the biggest, I think, myth of it all, is that we're happier with more sunlight. And I think anecdotally, we are, we have a beautiful day like yesterday, and we're all like plants, just, good to have the sunlight. But the extended hours of sunlight aren't to our benefit. Like I mentioned earlier, that melatonin production is triggered by the sun. And so the more that we're outside, the longer we're outside, the more delayed that is going to be. And so it's not even the difficulty of if we keep a routine, but if we're out later and in the sun later, trying to go to bed at 9, 10 o'clock, our bodies may not be ready.
With us today are Brianna Garrison, who's the assistant professor of social work at Southern Connecticut State University, and also Carol Conair. She's the editor of the Old Farmer's Almanac. Coming up, does daylight saving time actually conserve energy? We'll find out. Join the conversation. Let us know if you have any questions, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
Ever since you've been passing through the slumber room, no one else will see you, handkerchiefs across their faces. Tell me what grace is. Tell me what grace is.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Daylight saving time has been observed since World War I as a way to conserve fuel and energy. But does it actually do that? Recent research suggests maybe not. Joining us now is Matthew Cauchon. He's a professor of economics at the Yale School of Environment. Matthew, thanks for joining us today.
Hello, Catherine. Thanks for having me on.
And still with us is Brianna Garrison from Southern Connecticut State University, and also Carol Conair, who's the editor of the Old Farmer's Almanac. And listeners, let us know if you have any questions. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or let us know on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Matthew, what I'm so curious to hear, how did you first get interested in daylight saving?
Sure, Catherine. Well, it was sort of accidental. I'm an energy and environmental economist, and I think it was maybe about 15 years ago, I was at a conference in California, and it was an energy conference, and there were some folks participating in the meeting from Duke Energy who are in the Midwest, and in particular in Indiana, and they were just talking about how they almost missed their flight to come to the conference because we had just changed the clocks about the day before, and so they weren't sure. And for those who don't know, Indiana has a very interesting history of the practice of daylight saving time, where some counties in the state actually did it and some counties didn't. This changed in 2007, but so it was very confusing there. And they came and then we got talking about, well, why do we do daylight saving time? And then it became clear, as Carol said at the beginning of the show, that it originally is an energy saving policy. And so we started thinking, well, does it save energy or not? And since they were the utility company that distributed energy, I thought, well, they have the data and they actually know residential billing data for every house in the state or in the almost the entire Midwest. And so we got talking about the possibility of them sharing the data, and me and a PhD student at the time estimating the effect of the time change on energy consumption. And it basically provided a natural experiment that in a way enabled us to really estimate the effect of changing the time on residential electricity consumption. And as you indicated at the beginning, we found sort of a bit contrary, and I should just temper this because some more recent evidence studies that we have done contradict this result. But in Indiana at the time, we found that it led to about a 2.5% increase in electricity consumption, which of course is interesting because it's the opposite of what the policy was intended to do.
Was that a surprise? Because there's been some life changes, world changes, that kind of thing?
Well, I think it is. It was a bit of a surprise. I guess I didn't have very strong expectations when I did the study, but it was a surprise because it's the opposite of what you think of with a policy. And daylight saving time is part of the Energy Policy Act. It's explicitly supposed to save energy, but when you really think about it, as Carol also said at the beginning of the show, the whole impetus initially was about saving energy for illumination.
Right.
Benjamin Franklin's famous essay was about saving wax, tallow actually, for candles. And what we found in this study was there is still what we refer to as the Benjamin Franklin effect. It still does actually save energy for lighting. But the thing is, the amount of energy that we use for lighting is very small compared to the other types of energy that we use, which is for heating and cooling. Benjamin Franklin wasn't using, didn't have like a natural gas or an electric HVAC system in his house where he was adjusting the temperature.
Right.
He was probably throwing wood on his wood stove. And so he was, in fact, the idea does hold for lighting, but there's other sources of energy, and those are just much bigger and those offset the savings that you get from lighting.
Well, and I know your study is not specifically on this, but do we know or have any idea that if it really did help conserve energy in World War One?
I haven't found any evidence of that. I would guess that it probably did, although the magnitude is probably not that significant. I mean, look, it's almost like a physics definition. If you're sleeping in the morning when the sun is out, you're not using lights. But if you took that natural illumination and put it to the evening and you're not turning on your light, you are going to save energy for that purpose alone. But there's other types of behavioral adjustments that we do, and that's what the study started to illuminate. Those other things, when you account for them, makes the story a little bit more interesting.
And did you have like an ultimate goal or an ultimate aim when you set off to study daylight saving? I know it came out as sort of a side project for you, but what was the goal or the aim?
No, I mean, I'm an economist, so I kind of focus on like trade-offs and having specific questions, trying to come up with answer to them. And I'm not sort of a strong advocate one way or another on this issue. Although I will
Sure.
say over the past decade, I've been like attempted to be recruited by different groups to
Mhm.
advocate for or against, depending upon which study. And one of the things I've found is that nobody is neutral on the question of whether or not they like daylight saving time or not. But I think that one of the things that is important to keep in mind is it really kind of depends on like where you live, how you think about this issue. Everyone thinks about it as like, what should everybody do? Like there's one answer fits all. If you're on the eastern end of a time zone or the western end of a time zone where the sun rises sometimes up to about an hour and a half different in time and sets, you think very differently about where you'd like to have the clock set. Similarly, if you live north or south, the closer you get to the equator, the more uniform is the day length. And so down south or countries along the equator, they don't practice daylight saving time. And so it really makes a difference. And if you look at different states that are opposed to daylight saving time, you pretty much can tell where they are, north, south, or in the time zone. And of course, the other thing that matters is whether or not you have young children. I found a
Mm.
lot. People sort of like don't like the adjustment when they've conditioned their kids to their specific time when they can awake or go to bed.
I mean, that in of itself is chaotic. So if you have chaotic time changes, I imagine I can see why they're not fans of that. So it sounds like this might not actually be saving energy anymore. And talking about where you live, where we live here, and what does it look like for Connecticut?
Well, I don't. So this initial study that we did was focused on Indiana, and I think that Connecticut probably has, because of where it's positioned,
Hmm.
is actually probably quite similar to Indiana. But so I don't have specific estimates for Connecticut,
Sure.
except that we do have some current work now, and I do just want to sort of mention that we're finding we have a national based study now where we're not just looking at residential energy consumption, but we're looking at all electricity consumption on the grid. And what we're finding is that in some regions of the country, it increases energy consumption, and in some places, it decreases energy consumption. On average, for the country as a whole, it's pretty much neutral in a wash. But the more interesting finding that we're looking at now is we're looking at vehicle miles traveled in cars, what it does for people's driving behavior.
Hmm.
And there, the story is a little bit more interesting, and this would apply to Connecticut in particular because we're relatively east in our time zone and also relatively north. It turns out that people drive more when we move from standard time to daylight saving time. And so this is important because we use energy when we drive. And I think that it also has some implications on some of the things Brianna was mentioning at the beginning of the hour about traffic fatalities. It raises questions which we don't know the answer to yet, but is it that we're having more car accidents because people are tired, or is it because people are driving more because they have an extra hour of sunlight in the evening? And so that's the thing we're starting to unpack now, and we're starting to get some preliminary results. But it basically says, I think the interesting aspects when it comes to energy is not electricity anymore, but it's people's driving behavior.
I feel like I now have to get a new notebook and track all of my activities just to see if this is impacted. Because anecdotally, I think both what Carol and Brianna shared earlier, I'm hearing a lot of friends and family around me who feel like they're being impacted more this time around versus the previous years. And we have a caller who's calling in now from Wallingford who likes to share her experience. So Eiley McKean calling from Wallingford. Eiley, you're on the air.
Am I on there?
Yes, you are, Eiley. Tell us that you do
Okay,
not like
great.
going home in the dark.
So yeah, I dislike standard time so much because I get up, it's already light, and then I come home from work in the dark. It's full darkness, and that really distresses me far more. I feel like daylight savings time is the more natural to my rhythm, and I'd love to have it all year. I'd rather get up in the dark and watch the sunrise on my way to work and still have it be somewhat light when I get home. So I am totally into the idea of keeping daylight savings all year long. And changing time does disrupt me and my dog quite a bit. So.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and experience with Eiley. I feel like a lot of people also, that would resonate with a lot of people. Carol and Brianna, you've been listening to Eiley's comment here. Carol, what are your thoughts about what Eiley has to say?
I think she's right on. I think it really impacts people in certain places. And I feel that, like, same. At about 4:45 in December, it's getting dark here at our offices in Dublin, New Hampshire. And I also think about safety because, the roads are cold and icy and dark. And so there's a safety issue I think about at that time, and I prefer also to see that sunrise. But again, that's where we could make accommodations in workplaces if we wanted to, because then people's own proclivities and health benefits could be visited by that.
And Brianna, any thoughts with what Eiley has to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think safety plays a big part in that. And I think, leaving work when it's dark outside is hard on a lot of people. And I've lived in the South and I've lived in the North, and it's definitely a big difference with daylight savings, how early darkness comes here. And you see seasonal affective disorder is very real, very impacted by how much darkness happens in the fall and winter seasons. And there are a lot of places that don't have street lights. So traveling, there are a lot of, I'm thinking about Matthew's comments of more people on the road. And, anecdotally, I know that there are a lot of people in our town that are like, I need to be home by 5 because it's dark, and aren't going out in the evenings. And I think they're probably more willing to do that when there's sunlight and the weather isn't as bad. So you see those impacts. For me, I'm not on the side of I like daylight savings more than fallback. I just want a routine. So I don't want us, for overall health, I think the switching back and forth is what's really detrimental. So wherever we stay, I just want us to stay so that we can have the health benefits of being, in a natural rhythm and a routine that our bodies can predict.
Right. I think a lot of us would appreciate a standard routine to follow. And listeners, if you have a comment or a question about daylight saving, give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We also got a comment on Facebook from Sue. Sue shared, I'm so happy to be learning so much about DST and its negative repercussions. I've read news snippets about sleep disruption and increased car accidents and suicides, but so much more than that, although that's enough. I confess I'm a morning person and really enjoy the lighter earlier hours, but when people say they're so happy it's lighter later, I think to myself, well, just wait. By midsummer, it'll be plenty of light when you leave work anyway. Well, thank you so much, Sue, for sharing your thoughts with us. Matthew, can you respond here as well to what Sue has to share?
Well, it's certainly the case that in the middle of the summer, the day length actually gets longer. And so when you are in the middle of the summer, it changing the clocks has less of an impact on your morning routine. Although, people, I do think that people, when they have an extra hour of sunlight in the afternoon. By the way, one thing that makes it very confusing. I've been studying daylight saving time for a while, and I'm always very confused, and I find it incredibly difficult to kind of wrap your mind around when you're talking about it. We should call it daylight shifting time, not daylight saving time. That would be one way to kind of clarify what in fact is happening. But I do think that people actually really do enjoy on net that hour of sunlight at the end of the day because they're up and about. Now, I went to school in Michigan a long time ago, and there the sun would, it was light out until like almost 10 in the middle of the summer, almost 10 o'clock at night. And maybe that's like, too late for adjusting to our circadian rhythms and stuff, but that's the same time zone as Eastern Massachusetts, where it's very different. And so I guess when it comes to thinking one way or another, I think that the way we actually have it now, my own, I mean, this is not my research, this is just my own view. I think that the way that I am actually an advocate of daylight saving time and shifting back and forth between standard and daylight saving time. Although I think we had it right back in 2007, I think that the extensions that we did were pushing it a little bit too far into the winter. But I think that that's the kind of cuts all the different constituencies in the middle and has the adjustment. And so I think that that's the right way to go, because we've talked a lot about the adverse health effects of shifting the clock. But I think there's also a lot of health benefits of people being more active and being out in the evenings, and quantifying those is actually quite difficult and challenging. And so I'm not sure we have a good sense of the overall benefits and costs versus it, but based on the amount of feedback that I get, which seems to be weighted about 50-50, I think we probably have it about right in my own view.
And earlier we talked a lot about historical context in terms of legislation in the past, where some try to push one way or the other. And currently we are seeing more conversations at the federal level about daylight saving time. Previously, President Donald Trump has stated that daylight saving time is inconvenient and very costly to our nation. That's according to the Washington Post. But last week, he wasn't as decisive about this issue. And here's what he said.
It's a 50-50 issue. And if something's a 50-50 issue, it's hard to get excited about it. I assume people would like to have more light later, but some people want to have more light earlier because they don't want to take their kids to school in the dark. And it's a little bit one way, but it's very much a 50-50 issue. And it's something I can do, but a lot of people like it one way, a lot of people like it the other way. It's very even. And usually I find when that's the case, what else do we have to do?
Matthew, can we respond to what we heard from President Trump?
Sure. Well, I can't help but resist by saying that I would think it would be wonderful if the administration would actually use that logic in other issues as well. If things are about 50-50, maybe they should be left well enough alone, but maybe that's for another show. But I think that it's about right. I mean, I agree. I personally don't think that this is like a broken issue that requires changing. As I mentioned before, I think that the extensions that we did in the 2009, Europe didn't actually follow us in suit with that. So now every year we have 1 week in the fall and 3 weeks in the spring where we have differences in time. And I think clocks are the time is an artificial human creation, and it's a coordination mechanism. I think it's just very important that we actually try to stay coordinated to have different timings when people go to work. I mean, it was the Uniform Time Act. It was based on the railroads that we actually set, standards for time so that people would know when trains would come in and when they would depart. And I think the coordination mechanism is quite important. And I think from an economics perspective, that is really critical.
Well, before we go to break, I want to take a call from Diane, who's calling from Meriden. Diane, you're on the air.
Hi. I'm an old lady, and most of my friends and I really love daylight savings time because it means we can go out to supper and be with other people since we don't like driving in the dark. Most older people don't like driving in the dark, and so this gives us a chance to be more social and go out to different things in the evening when it doesn't get dark as early. And I hate waking up super early before the daylight savings time happens because it's very hard to keep total light out of a bedroom. And so anyway, I'm very much in favor of daylight savings time, and most of my friends are too. It allows us to be more active in our communities. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Diane, for calling in and sharing us with your story. And I'm glad to hear that you're able to enjoy supper with your friends, and happy to hear that you can be more social. And Brianna, clearly, we are hearing a lot of different experiences here. We'd love for you to react to what Diane has to share here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a major benefit, like socialization, the isolation. I mean, I could talk for hours about the impact of isolation on our particularly older adults. And so for me, hearing Diane share her story and say, hey, I can get out. I feel safer. I think that's a big piece of it, right? What are we doing with the time that we have? What are the benefits that we get from it? Those protective factors, socialization is such a big protective factor for health risks too. We're talking about the adverse impact, but that's a benefit. I think then we have to look at, okay, well, when we fall back in the fall, then that means we kind of go into a period of hiding, right? It's dark at 4 o'clock, and so we're not going to go out with our friends for the next 4 or 5 months. And those are the things where it's like, what are we giving up in this situation? How does it impact our bodies? How does it impact our sleep? How does it impact our social patterns? And I think really taking a deep look at it, what are the costs and benefits? We know kind of sparks here. It'd be interesting to do a study on a place like Arizona that doesn't do the flip, and really look at the mental health benefits. But also, as Matthew mentioned, their sunlight rhythms are different than other places where it may not be as big of a deal, right? Like in New England, where it is really dark very early. So I think it's all things for us to take into consideration. But what I'm hearing is there are periods where, hey, I can enjoy these things more. And there are periods where you kind of have to take away social activities because of the time change and the daylight change.
Well, when we fall back, that's usually when I call it my hermit time. So those are the vibes I go into in the fall. So our guests will all be staying with us, Carol, Brianna, and Matthew. And after we come back, we will continue our conversation on daylight saving time and hear how it could be changed at the local level. Let us know if you have any questions or share your experiences, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Daylight saving time has long been an unpopular idea. Many farmers have been historically opposed to this practice. That's according to Farm Progress, an online publication of farm and ranch news. But more than 100 years later, it still remains a practice observed in almost every state in the union. But could that change? With that question, I'm going to jump straight to Carol here. We have a shorter segment here, so I'm going to try to get to everything we want to get to. We were talking about policy and bills earlier. So here in Connecticut, State Rep Kirk Vale introduced a bill last year to keep Connecticut permanently on daylight saving time. What would this bill do in practice, Carol? Would it mean we no longer switch our clocks in the fall, or is that not the case?
That's right. To stay on permanent daylight savings time would be not change again. The way things are right now, that's the way it stays. And of course, other states have other proposals. There's 18 states that are working on different legislation or ideas, and they are not all just to move to daylight savings. Some want to stay at standard.
And I want to play a quick clip here. Here's what State Rep Kirk Vale shared with us about these efforts.
Connecticut's attached, a lot of business and employees attached to New York as well. So in our bill, it turned into, if we were to pass it, year-round daylight savings, there's no such time zone as daylight savings. So what we'd have to do is move into the Atlantic time zone and then eliminate daylight savings. And I represent an agricultural community. And so the old rumors is that, this was done for farmers. So I went and talked to our local farmers to see what they thought of it and some business owners. And they actually supported that idea. So I submitted the bill and it got a lot of media attention, which I didn't anticipate. And it's got a lot more support as the years have gone on. And on a national level, there's a contingent of people out that want to go year-round standard time and get rid of daylight savings altogether. I did a lot of research on it, and I certainly prefer, the later hours in the summer, and that it wouldn't be so dark in the winter because that affects seasonal affective disorder and all that.
So really quickly here, Carol, some reactions?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what the president said too, 50-50 for half the states. It might make sense to be on standard time and half of them on daylight savings, just depending on where you are. So I think when you look at the bigger context, to Matthew's point, having coordination is super important, especially we're a global society and we've already really killed the idea of natural light dictating our days. But yet we haven't really looked to other places to be flexible. If we standardize daylight savings or daylight switching time, if we standardize that, we can make adjustments elsewhere when we pay attention to more cars on the road, these cardiovascular impacts. Can we switch up work hours from 7:30 to 3:30, or if those things are flexible, or schools? I think there's other places where we can pay attention to the impacts when we know it's really not about energy anymore.
Well, and actually on that note, really quickly here, Brianna, about 45 seconds, are there ways we can prepare for daylight saving?
Yeah, certainly. I think being intentional. So make a gradual shift every day beforehand and afterwards, slowly doing 10 or 15 minutes, sticking to your sleep schedule. So not letting the change keep you up an hour later, not giving in to those, those changes in your sleep hygiene, following good sleep hygiene, getting blackout curtains, not staying on your phone, getting out in the sun, even if it's, at lunch, getting a walk in, trying to really use it. And then the last thing is really reducing the substances that you're using. Try to limit your caffeine, limit your alcohol intake so that we're not using substances to adjust our body system up or down.
In about 30 seconds here, Matthew, any final thoughts you have for our listeners today?
I guess my final thought would be that I think that having different time zone policies at the local or state level is not a great idea, respectfully for those who do it. I think we've addressed that in the past, and we found that it was helpful to have a uniform time act. And we also tried moving to year-round daylight saving time in the 1970s, as we mentioned in the show, and people didn't like it. So I think that we should be careful about the rush and the urge to change these practices. I think there's a reason why for the past 4 decades we've kept roughly on a daylight saving time switch.
Well, I want to thank all of our guests today for demystifying and helping us understand daylight saving better. I want to thank Brianna Garrison, who's an assistant professor at Southern Connecticut State University. Brianna, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
You are also listening to Carol Connor, who's the editor of the Old Farmer's Almanac. Carol, it was a pleasure having you on.
Great discussion. Thank you.
And also with us was Matthew Colton, who's the professor of economics at the Yale School of the Environment. Matthew, appreciate your time as well.
Thanks. Interesting discussion.
Absolutely. Learned so much today. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much for listening and hope everyone gets really good rest after this today.